to the second day of the international seminar on exploring the realm of the mental, cognition, emotion, and volition. We will now start our fifth academic session, which is the first session for today. And we have as our speakers Professor Daniel de Hutto, Professor of Philosophical Psychology at the University of Wollongong, Australia. As our second speaker, we have Professor Amita Chatterjee, who is Professor Emerita, School of Cognitive Science, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And we have Professor Maushumi Guha, who is a professor at the Department of Philosophy, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And this session will be chaired by Professor R.C. Pradhan. I request the chairperson to please come up on the stage and start the session. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We will start today's program with the lecture by Professor Daniel Hutto. Since Professor Sarath Deshpande could not come for personal reasons, so I am really his deputy here. So I will be taking this opportunity to thank Professor Chakravarti for giving me this opportunity. As we know, we have to manage our time, and we also have space for discussion. For that, I will follow the pattern initiated by Professor Chatterjee, that every paper will be for 25 minutes presentation and 5 minutes will be for discussion. The discussion will take place after the completion of the presentation of the paper. So before I invite Professor Hutto to speak, let me read out his biodata, which is so interesting and it will be of interest to everybody. Professor Daniel de Hutto is an American philosopher and professor of philosophical psychology jointly at the University of Wollongong and at the University of Hertfordshire. He is known for his research on Enactivism, affect, folk psychology, and Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophy. He is also known for designing and heading the degree of Western civilization at the University of Wollongong. This degree has led to controversy due to being funded by the Ramsay Center, of which former Prime Ministers Toby Abbott and John Howard are board members. Among his publications, let me read out a few. One is Radicalizing Enactivism, Basic Minds Without Content. The other is Folk Psychological Narratives, the Sociocultural Basis of Understanding Reasons, Wittgenstein and the End of Philosophy, Neither Theory Nor Therapy. And the other one is a jointly authored book, Daniel de Hutto and Matthew Redfield, edited book, Folk Psychology Reassessed. So with these remarks, I now request Professor Hutto to speak.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and the organizers for putting together this really wonderful event. I'm only disappointed that I can't actually be there in person, but good morning, everyone who's there in the audience. Hello. I just want to also just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Australia. So I just want to pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land and emerging elders, past, present, and future. With that out of the way, and since we're short on time, this will be a kind of thumbnail overview of Enactivism as it's understood today, and the challenge. I will return to the challenge I think that it poses to cognitivism, at least in the varieties of Enactivism that myself and Eric Mayen have advanced, which I think is in tune with the original version of the position defended by or presented initially almost 30 years ago in a very compelling book, The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche. And I'll explain a little bit about that as we go on. So the first thing I'd like to do is to say a little bit about the core commitments that I think that enactivists ought to have. And I'm going to skip some recent discussions and get down to a statement in particular that was given by, presented by Evan Thompson himself in a review of the book that Eric Meehan and myself wrote in 2017 called Evolving Enactivism. And in the review, Evan expressed the view that there really are two central pillars of the enactivist view of the mind. And those are that, as he put it, quote, the enactive approach is a cognitive science research program based on two interconnected pillars. One pillar, he says, is the rejection of the representational theory of mind and acceptance of the thesis that embodied interaction can be constitutive or is constitutive of cognition. And the second pillar is that the concept that one accepts the concept of biological autonomy and that one sees biology as a basis for mindedness. And as he puts it, for an account to be enactive in the full and precise sense of the term, it must include both theoretical projects or commitments. Now, as it happens in the book, and I won't take any time here to go through this, it would take too much, Evan seemed to think that that we perhaps in our version of enactivism didn't accept both of these two conditions. Certainly, I think he may have questioned whether we were committed to the second one in the same kind of way that he has been. Now, that's a nuance that people may want to ask about in questions. However, I just want to say that I believe that we, in fact, are. And I do think this is not a bad set of commitments, although I don't know that I want to defend the view that there's an essence to enactivism as such, but these would certainly be signature commitments at the core of any properly enactivist position on the mind. So then what makes enactivism so interesting, I think, in a summary comment, is that it goes to the idea that cognition occurs in living systems. That's the only place it's really found, and not in machines. And the acceptance of the thesis about biological autonomy really pushes us in this direction. Now, I won't have time to say anything, although I've written a lot on the issues of emotion and phenomenology and how these come into play. I'm focusing more here on the first claim, that we want to move away from the idea that minds are essentially computational devices for representing the world, which is the core of their content, and that their thinking is done by means of algorithmic manipulation. So in Thompson's words, to capture this commitment, he says that mind is lifelike and life is mind-like. Or again, Alvin tells us, quote, where we discern life, we have everything we need to discern mind. And the real core of this is that the problem with a machine is that although you can get very sophisticated outcomes, these are all driven by some form of heteronomous instruction or constraint, whereas in living systems, the precarious ways in which they make their way in the world, interact and adjust, are always autonomous. So whilst you can get the one to mimic the other in performance or outputs, in fact, they're not driven by the same sorts of operations at all. Now, enactivists often bring forth a rather extravagant claim, which is to say that we organisms and minded creatures bring forth their worlds. That is to say, as they put it, through self-productive and adaptive activities, organisms turn, quote, an indifferent physiochemical world into an environment of biological significance. And this is true of even the most simple organisms, and therefore, on this thesis, a kind of mindedness emerges wherever this happens. And this is minimally what enactivists mean by speaking of organisms bringing forth or enacting their own worlds. Cognitive beings and their domains of significance dynamically co-emerge through the activities of the organisms themselves. They're not separable. So, to take a famous, or one of the most famous examples, we would say, quote, and this is borrowing again from Thompson, quote, although sucrose is a real and present condition of the physiochemical environment, its status as food is not. That sucrose is a nutrient is not intrinsic to the status of the sucrose molecule. It is rather a relational feature linked to the bacterium's metabolism. Now, what went from what on the face of it might be a rather extravagant way of speaking, that we bring forth whole worlds, is transformed even in this very tight sense, and I think in a way that would be acceptable to anyone, even in the hardest sciences, as a rather anodyne claim. No one wants to suggest that sucrose has a status of food in the absence of organisms that use it such. So that claim, while it may seem rather extravagant, is in fact, I think, rather modest. Sucrose has significance or value as, or is, in fact, becomes food, but only in the milieu that the organism itself brings into existence. So without organisms, sucrose may exist, but it will not exist as any kind of food. And the nice way that enactivists kind of capture this thought, and this is something they contrast with the starting points of a vision of mind that is of a more classically cognitivist, mechanical nature, is that we can therefore understand the organism's relation to aspects of its environments that are part of its domain of significance by remembering that organisms don't get parachuted into an alien world. The worlds that they relate to are already worlds that they help to bring into being and are intimately related with. I actually think this is probably one of the most important points to understand the two different starting points of the frameworks. If you start with the idea that you can just have mechanisms that you have to connect to their environments, it transforms many of the projects in philosophy of mind. And I think this is really one of the things that lies at the heart of the difference between these two ways of thinking. What is the basis of mindedness in the world? So this picture is one that is completely rejected by the enactivists. So at root, enactivists think of cognition, organisms engage in as that of continuously engaging with environments that are significant to them, and that they bring into being rather than as minds represent what would be pre-existing and otherwise neutrally meaningless worlds. So the task of cognition and the nature of cognition and the character of cognition looks very different according to these two very different pictures of what basic minds are. Okay. Now, I put this up just as a kind of illustration, and I've used it before, to capture the idea that this will, of course, also attach to not just the directedness of a creature's thoughts, but also its phenomenology. In this case, all of the things happening and all of the factors around the organisms may be part of its the factors that make a difference to its phenomenal experience, for example, like what it is like to drive a car under these conditions. And they don't stop short of, and they're not produced simply by what's going on internally to the system. Of course, even using this graphic just to illustrate, what's wrong about this is the depiction of the car as a kind of engine that could be replaced or dealt with. If we think of things in biological terms, of course, that's a misdescription in and of itself. So I just want to emphasize that the way that this becomes an interrelation with aspects of the environment is such that it's better to understand this in what I would call extensive rather than merely extended terms, which is a familiar trope of functionalist theories of mind. Okay. Now, those, I think, are some of the core commitments of an enactivist position, and I think already you can see that they disagree with the starting points of cognitivist positions that are very common and perhaps the more mainstream and dominant views in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, at least in Anglo-American traditions. Varieties, there are many different varieties of enactivism, and I just want to highlight a few differences, and then I will come back and finish this lecture by just highlighting what I think is a serious challenge that can be raised above and beyond the starting point issues that I just raised that can help people to, I think, put pressure on cognitivist thinking. But first, let me just illustrate, I think, that not all forms of enactivism can avail themselves of that style of argument, and why that's so. One way of thinking about different versions of enactivism might be to, go back to use the notion of a virus or a parental strain, since that's going to be familiar to everyone around the world, and to think that what happens is some aspects, additional commitments become more core, or there's some aspects that are added to the original version that would not be found in all other variants. So if we think of the extended, the embodied mind as being the source of the first original version of enactivism, then you could think that there might be different variations of this. And you might even think the kind of radical enactivism that I've been propounding over the years is a kind of variant of these. I could say a lot more about that if people wanted to pick that up in questions, but I'll skip that for now and simply note that there at least are a number of different variant forms of enactivism on the philosophical market. So in current times, apart from the one that I've been pushing with Eric Meehan, Alva Noe has at various times described himself as an enactivist and advanced enactivist theories with his sensory motor theories. Evan Thompson, of course, was one of the original authors of The Embodied Mind, but has also produced original works on his own, Mind and Life. And then also we find with Ezekiel DePaulo and others defending different varieties of enactivism himself. I would say that Thompson's and DePaulo's very strongly build from what we had with Varela, although I think they each add certain important elements. But one of those, I think, positions doesn't really belong, or at least let me put it like this, insofar as it still can be counted as a kind of an activist position, it embeds too much of the traditional cognitivist way of thinking to count, I think, as one that could challenge cognitivism at the very root. And that is the position advanced by Alva. Now, in a longer talk, I would have had more time to really make the case here, and I could have taken you back to his original works and how his views have shifted over time. I don't have time for that, I'm afraid, today, given the constraints. But I simply just say that even as of 2021, his most recent paper on this topic, Alva Noe remains committed as ever to the idea that world-presenting experience makes claims on how things are, claims that effectively can be objectively true or false, and thereby, I think, entails, as he had in his original work, entails that his way of thinking is quite representationalist, that it still has the idea that even in perceptual experience, there will be representational correctness conditions. And moreover, that our capacity to enjoy such experience rests on an implicit practical knowledge and understanding, which is difficult to understand although he, I think, attempts to do this, it's difficult for many to understand what that kind of understanding is without appealing to standard cognitivist tropes. So I think this invokes on two different levels, both the level of explaining the nature of our ability to engage appropriately in experience, and also to think about the content of experiences. I think there's two ways in which I think Alva's position is too close and too conservative to distinguish itself and make a serious challenge to the core ideas of Cognitivism. It's too friendly to them, let's put it that way. So now I'm just going to, in the home stretch, work through what I think raises challenges to Cognitivism and why I think this is important work that needs to be done above and beyond saying that the two positions disagree in starting points. Why should we prefer an activist position over the other as opposed for any reason other than just a matter of taste? And I do think there can be arguments that might persuade us to prefer an activism over Cognitivism. So let me say here. And first of all, although he doesn't use the term here or the same terms here, I'm going to quote Jerry Fodor from 2008 just to highlight again why I think this discussion is to be absolutely fundamental in the debates over the nature of the philosophy of mind. I think it goes to the very framework of how we think about minds. So Fodor puts it this way, quote, "There's lots of issues that a sufficiently shameless philosopher of mind can contrive to have both ways, but not the issue between pragmatists and Cartesians. Pragmatism is the enemy par excellence of Cartesian realism about mental states." He didn't mention enactivism and cognitivism, but you can slap those words in here too. The issues between enactivists and cognitivists is something that we should have to decide as a fundamental issue of philosophical framework, and I believe the two positions are completely at odds with one another on fundamentals. So I would only say that the feeling is entirely mutual. Radical enactivism, the version that I've been pushing for some time, rejects fundamentally these things. This would take a lot longer lecture to take you through the details of it. It rejects representationalism, but it also rejects computationalism. And it also rejects, most fundamentally of all, and this is in fact highlighted in the original 2013 book, Radicalizing Enactivism, information processing views of the mind. Although not many people focus on this, they usually focus first on the representational aspects. It also rejects functionalism if we understand functionalism as wedded to the idea of a input-output device modeled on a heteronomous machine. So when I say this, I'm saying that the idea, very familiar, that information is sourced from the senses to produce cognitive activity, which then generates simple activity like the movement of the hand, is a picture that is rejected wholesale by the enactivists, and partly on the grounds that information isn't the kind of thing, if we understood it as per other naturalistic theories, the sort of thing that could even be picked up or transformed or used. Those, I think, are bankrupt metaphors that are very common in cognitive sciences, but they're not, I think, ones that can be cashed out or discharged at the end of the day. The other idea is the idea that the brain stores information, say, in memory and then reuses it and rehouses it, I think is, again, a kind of a theoretical myth. Brains, I think, don't have the capacity to pick up and store information. What they can become is sensitive to correlations, and those sensitivities can be preserved. That gives a different way of thinking about what is, in fact, going on with neural dynamics. It would agree that cognition is not lazy. It doesn't sit around for inputs and then move as per machine parts to act on the world. And that, of course, has been picked up in a lot of more mainstream thinking, even, which is still representational and computational in nature, but work on predictive processing and the anticipatory brain. But I would say that the enactivist way of understanding what's happening at the core of this is very unlike that of the of this traditional cognitivist picture. And similarly, like extended stories, which have become more popular, it denies that cognition is just the meat in the sandwich, it's just what happens inside the head. So there has been a move to more extended views of mind, but often, as I said earlier, these still embed a kind of computational, representational functionalism that the enactivist positions challenge. Okay. So really at the core of it is the idea that mindedness is found in the interactions with things in the world. And if you notice the way this drawing goes, that dynamic continues to be looping back and forth. you don't see an arrow here where the information is somehow picked up from the item and an inner surrogate is used, or somehow that information is stored to produce more cognitive activity. The activity is there in the wider sense. The brain is involved, but what it's doing is not as a storehouse or collector of information and then a representational device for making use of that information on this picture. Okay. So I can't take you through all that. I'm only giving you the sense in which those core claims get challenged by Enactivists. And now I just want to very briefly highlight, I think, where the source of the core challenge comes. Both Eric and I, in our 2013 book, described the problem as the hard problem of content. And in one review, this is my favorite comment on this, comes from a review some time ago. The author writes, calling the issue the hard problem of content is both justified and rhetorically inspired, given the way it imports the obvious miasma of consciousness research into the very heart of cognitive science. Hutto and Meehan wield it the way a hero wields a wooden stake in a vampire movie. They patiently map out the implicatures of various content-dependent approaches, show how each of them cope with various challenges, and then finally hammer the hard problem of content through their conceptual heart. This, I think, is the work that needs to be done if we're going to persuade people to move away from cognitive theories by means of argument and analysis. I can't rehearse all the moves here, but let me just say that I do think this is the core of it. Really, the core problem is that if you want to trade in information processing, representational, computational stories, and you also want to be an explanatory naturalist, which most people working in philosophy of mind, cognitive science do, then there is a challenge to what I call the unrestricted thesis that cognition must involve content of some kind. And that challenge is to provide, without gaps, as Treitsky had told us a long time ago, quote, a framework for understanding how meaning can evolve, how genuine cognitive systems can develop out of lower order, purely physical information processing mechanisms. But if those mechanisms only start with and use information as covariance, and that is not any kind of content, then I think this creates a philosophical puzzle or problem that in fact undermines this project from the get-go. But people can follow up with this after if they're interested. I don't have time to go through that detail that is in the writings, but I think that presents an Achilles heel that defeats cognitivism unless it comes up with a better answer. But it certainly, at the very least, to stick with the foot metaphors, puts their theoretical framework on the back foot rather than something that one can just obviously accept. Notice this is not a matter of preference. This is a point of, if this is the serious theoretical problem that I think it is, then I believe that is enough reason for us to want to either avoid or find cleverly a way to revive the fortunes of cognitivism rather than simply go with the conceptual inertia of accepting it. Why should we take it seriously? Well, I think that when people are working at the very hardest and doing the best they can to actually say how minds have become representational, or indeed where they're getting their initial contents from, or how those contents become the kinds of things that cognitivists need them to have, in the work of Ruth Millikan is one, and we hosted her here in Australia not long ago. Ruth herself admitted that the picture of content that is favored by, say, Karen Neander, who shares her views about biosemantics, is not the kind of position that she thinks you can get from the views of a biological function that she's been propounding, which, let's just put it this way, set the cats amongst the pigeons amongst that rather distinguished audience, because people were surprised to hear that they couldn't get the full-fledged sort of content that most people want to have out of these theories simply by appeal to her work. Okay, so on the positive upswing, I think that what we get when we look very hard, and I think this is enough, and it's consistent with the account that I've been propounding as of a radical and activist variety, is that we get something more like, out of biological functionality, quote, an important kind of natural involvement relation, but not representation or anything close to it. Or, as Rob Rupert put it, it bears some kind of privilege relation, but that's not going to be a semantic relation. And the privileging and the involvement relations here are consistent with the enactivist starting point, which holds that organisms themselves have been adapted and connected to their environments in special sorts of ways. What I began with at the very beginning of the lecture, when we rejected the idea that organisms just find themselves parachuted into alien worlds. Okay. Just to finish then, if you want more on this, the hard problem of content, I think, has yet to be answered. I continue to. We do have a few people who've claimed to have answered it and responded to it, but I don't think those efforts have been successful. And if you want more, there's some references to papers here where we've explored that. I think we still, therefore, lack naturalist explanations of how states of mind could have or acquire the contents cognitivists assume that they must have. And fundamentally, we don't have an account of how contents qua contents could make a causal difference, even if states of mind were assumed to possess such contents. Just assuming it, rather than giving an explanation of the origins, the natural origins of such content. If that's the case, I think it gives us reason to prefer some form of enactivist accounts over cognitivist accounts. And I think it gives us a special reason within enactivism to avoid those kinds of enactivist accounts that are overly friendly or rely on cognitivist assumptions. So, just to finish, a famous song by Mercer from long ago. I don't think this is a negative thesis. I think this is accentuating the positive. I think it's showing why we have reason to prefer one position over the other, one framework. I think we eliminate the negative when we eliminate misconceptions about how the mind works, and that we can latch on to the affirmative. And what we should not do is bother with this in-between positions that sort of are halfway house between the two, because I think they're unstable and, conceptually unsafe. Thank you very much.
Hutto, for the excellent presentation of a very challenging theory called Enactivism. I think it will create, it has created already a lot of interest in the audience. Now I invite questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Hutto. This is Madhuchanda Sen from Jadavpur University. I would just like to know if at all we can blend biosemantics or teleological theories into your radical enactivism. Is that possible?
I think to some extent this has been the project of my entire career, or at least assessing it has been the project of my entire career. But I still stand by a very early assessment. I think what I've talked about in my books, I think we get a form of biosemiotics is the more correct answer that can provide a platform for the development of, so I don't deny that we develop thoughts that have content, and we can think true thoughts, for example, or have reference in the usual full-blown semantic sense. But I don't think that the biology can get us there. Now, that's a lot longer stories. Ruth Millikan is probably one of in my list of philosophical heroes, she's very up there at the top, sitting alongside Donald Davidson and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And her project was to do exactly what you said, which is to provide a biosemantics. I think at best, and she of course was relying on Peirce herself when she gave her account, I think she at best provided us with a biosemiotics. It doesn't get us the kind of full semantic content that would be needed for representationalism. I have very, very much already written on this, and I'd be very happy to send you more. I think it would take a lot of time to spell out the reasons for that, but the answer to the question is it's a little yes and no, but it's mostly no, because I think under the standard conceptions of biosemantics, we need to adjust that theory precisely to get an account of intentionality that doesn't embed semantic content in the standard way.
Okay, the mic should go to this side.
You're welcome.
We can take 3 questions, sorry, because of our time constraint. Mic there, yeah. Because of the light, really I cannot see. It is falling on my eyes.
Hello from Jadavpur University. I'm Maushumi Guha. Hi. So my question is, so one of my research scholars just finished his PhD on a connection between information ethics and artificial agency. But at the end of it, probably there was an attempt to connect some kind of radical enactivism or at least radical embodiment with information ethics of Luciano Floridi. But I wanted to talk to you about this just a little bit, if you think this is a possible combination. And if not, what kind of alternative ethics you might be having in mind. Thank you.
Now, it's a really tricky one. I used to room with Luciano in Hertfordshire. We sat in the same room for many years. I'm still not 100% certain, after all that time, exactly what notions of information he's committing to. But often, when I would speak to him, he didn't have a very semantically based notion. So, as far as the notion is, and the line that I'm taking on, so far as the notion of information doesn't break faith with or smuggle in anything beyond traditional notions that might be found in Shannon and elsewhere. The core of it is codes. But in some cases, people try to embed other commitments into their understanding of what information is. And even people who talk, they say that they're just using Shannon's notion, are in fact, I think, sometimes embedding semantics. So I would almost have to see the details to answer that question properly. But I think that those are the parameters that you'd want to test to see whether or not there were any difficulties. Thank you, though, for that. It's a great question. It's a very interesting project.
Thank you so much.
Mike should come to Professor Panda here. I think that should be the last question.
Yeah, I am Ranjan, and I would like to know how the enactivists really look at the concept of memory to separate, the representational content or experiential content, rather. Yeah.
Great question, and I was just speaking about this at Macquarie University on episodic memories. I will defend, as you might expect, a very strong anti-cognitivist position, but you're right, most people think memory is the impossible task. It's impossible to explain without representations. I actually think that what we think of as episodic memory can certainly have phenomenological aspects. I don't think that's anything at issue with enactivist positions, but I don't think that we remember by means of some device that stores contents. It gets tricky because some of the new work on constructivist simulation accounts tend to still embed a cognitivist framework, and I think they do so unnecessarily, they do so problematically. So if you really wanted, in all of these questions, and I just say to everyone generally here, I have, if people want more references or further reading, I can certainly supply that to you if the organizers want to write to me. But I have just a recent paper on remembering without a trace. So getting rid of the idea that we have contentful traces or informational traces as the basis of our remembering, even if there is reenactment going on, right? So partial reenactment. And I think that a lot of the things that we think of as episodic memories are really autobiographical memories that are scaffolded by narrative practices. They're not something that happens in nature in the wild. The last comment on this is that if you look at the animal data, there's not a lot of strong reasons to think that animals have the ability to remember specific events time dated in their past. So why on earth should humans have that as a natural capacity either? So I think there's a lot of flexibility for revisiting and challenging some of the standard assumptions about what memory is and how it works.
Thank you, Professor Hutto, for this excellent interaction with our audience. We are sorry
thanks
because
to
of
the
time,
audience
really,
for wonderful questions.
Yeah, I think they can communicate with you. I think you will be free to interact with them online if possible. Sorry, this lecture is over and discussion is over. Now I invite Professor Chatterjee to come to the dais. And also, I invite Professor Maushumi Guha to be here. Yeah.
He's most welcome to stay with us.
Yeah. If you are free, please stay with us. Professor Hutto.
Yes.
If you are free, please be with us for some time.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So, friends, before I invite Professor Chatterjee to speak, let me introduce her, though it's no introduction here. Professor Chatterjee is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Philosophy and School of Cognitive Science, Jadavpur University. Widely published, her books include Understanding Vagueness, Bharatiya Dharmaniti, Mental Reasoning, Experiments and Theories, co-authored with Smita Sarkar, Indian Philosophy and Meditation, co-authored with Rahul Banerjee, Acharya Brajendranath Sil, Kalpagalpe Manodarshan, Philosophy of Mind through Thought Experiments, the study of internal states in theory and practice, a perspective from Indian psychology, co-authored with Rahul Banerjee and Prita Mukhopadhyay. With this short introduction, I now invite Professor Chatterjee to make our presentation.
Good morning. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizer for giving me this opportunity to listen to and get engaged with the brilliant papers and brilliant scholars in this 2.5-day seminar, which it would not have been possible had this seminar not taken place. And today in my presentation, I'm going to argue for a very obvious and innocuous thesis. You might ask me that why waste the prime time by arguing for an obvious and innocuous thesis? Because you know that it goes against our common belief and the way we have been raised. We have been told, say, right from our childhood, that our gut feelings are not to be relied. They are not reliable, and we should keep our cool, and we should always follow our reason to avoid, catastrophic consequences. And so this is somewhat a common sense traditional view. And as John Elster wrote, that the traditional view of this kind of anti-emotion theories is that emotions interfere with rational choice. They are, as it were, sand in the machinery of action. Now, this view is commonly held and is generally attributed to Plato but that is a wrong attribution, of course, because Plato used a metaphor in the context of the tripartite division of the self. And in his Republic, he uses this famous metaphor of the charioteer driving two horses, one obedient, standing for rational and moral impulses, and the other, unruly, which symbolizes appetites and passions. And as if emotions are constantly threatening us to break from the control of reason and pull us in the wrong direction. However, even a cursory reading of Plato shows that his condemnation of emotion was not total. Rather, he pointed out that when the emotions are properly under the control of reason, they can be helpful. Raw emotions definitely cause upheavals in our thought, but in the Western world, except the Stoics and Kant, no other philosopher exalted pure reason at the cost of emotions, especially in our rational and moral life. And I can tell you on the authority of Richard Sorabji, who has written that Stoicism, as formulated by Chrysippus, was opposed to nearly all emotion. And Kant saw emotions as external disruptive forces that take away our ability to deliberate rationally and lead us to act irrationally. So, the philosophical consensus is, even though the unruly horse requires continuous control by reason, it has intrinsic value of its own and an important motivating role in the pursuit of the good. The intellectual element is not always sufficient for making good and correct choices. Important information is also pointed out by the passions. And so I am going to support the thesis that in many cases, especially when taking decision under uncertainty, emotions are our best guides, even without the control of reason, for making the right choice. Before I proceed further, I would like to point out that in this exercise, I'm going to use reason and emotion as umbrella terms. I'm not going to the semantic nitty-gritties of the concepts of reason and emotion, because these terms have been used in various different senses. As for example, reason has been used to mean the faculty of reason, which is the source of thinking, judging, and inferring. It has been used to refer to justification and explanation of actions, and also, rationality and reasonableness of a state or a state of statements. Likewise, I'm not going to distinguish among sentiments, affections, and passions, which are available in our philosophical literature for the purpose of this paper, and nor am I going to make the distinction between incidental and integral emotions in this context. I'll take, reason and emotion as broad terms, and then I would like to point out that this contemporary pro-emotion evolutionary theories actually trace emotions back to the origin of its origin to the primordial brain or the reptilial brain, and their development through this limbic brain and to the neocortex. And according to these pro-emotion theorists, emotions evolved and were selected because these gave our ancestors some adaptive advantages. Cosmides and Tooby, two leading proponents of this theory, upheld that emotions coordinate independent programs governing perception, memory, learning, goal choice, etc., to produce adaptive responses to certain classes of stimuli that are associated with reliable cues, signaling their presence in the environment. And Robert Levinson has written that evolution has endowed humans with exquisite cognitive powers which provide myriad possibilities of action and inaction for responding to environmental challenges. Emotion is the antidote to the problems caused by this embarrassment of riches. And he writes that, hearkening back to an earlier stage of phylogenetic development, emotions provide us with access to a limited number of simpler, time-tested modes of efficient, effective adaptations. In situations where hesitation could have the most dire consequences, emotion functions to set aside cognitive processing that is too cumbersome, too obsessive, too self-indulgent, and ultimately too likely to be inconclusive. This is a quote from Levinson. And if you consider the example of, say, predator threats, as has been discussed by all these pro-emotion theorists, you can realize that in face of the predator threats, one need to be able to turn one's attention to it, and one need to deprioritize everything else and quickly decide the correct course of action. And emotions are a way of doing this. And as Antonio Damasio has pointed out, that evolution has helped us to develop some somatic markers, some bodily marks, which help us in practical decision making. And in case of, say, practical decision making, emotion really improve the situation by giving access to reasons, by facilitating planning agency, by supplementing decision theoretic reasoning, and by showing us what appropriate action we are supposed to take in a particularly precarious situation. And so you see that emotions provide us real good guidance in case of decision making under uncertainty. And emotions help us decide which of our concerns is more important when several are implicated in a choice situation, and also to pursue long-term goals which requires us to sacrifice present goods for greater future ones. We have the tendency of going for the present advantages and to ignore the greater future goods, but emotion tells us to sacrifice present goods for greater future ones. And Damasio has shown that patients who suffer from trauma in prefrontal cortices seem to have profoundly impaired in their ability to plan and make good decisions. I know that many of you who have read Descartes' Error, you remember Damasio's most famous patient, Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who sustained major injury in his prefrontal cortex. Though Gage was normal in his general intelligence and ability to reason, the loss of capacity to feel emotions caused an inability to order goals and to form and act in accordance with long-term plans. The way emotions help one to form and act on plans is by attaching a feeling or a value and motivational force to possible future events, thus allowing one to pay sufficient attention to them. And thus emotions supplement decision theoretic reasoning by circumscribing and reducing the number of options. And we have to take into account, and the number of options we have to consider instead of endlessly deliberating about a potentially infinite set of factors. And as you remember, the predicament of the robot in the frame problem, who took infinitely long time to decipher the relevant from the irrelevant conditions. But because the robot doesn't have any emotion, but we are aided by our emotion in taking up the relevant course of action in a given situation. But how do those emotions facilitate action? Emotions can facilitate appropriate action because of the physiological changes involved in emotions, which usually consists of some sort of physiological arousal that primes us for action. deliberation by itself may not produce sufficient motivation for action. Emotions can aid practical reason by ensuring that when we identify an option as salient, we are also motivated and primed to carry it out. But the question arises that do specific emotions prepare for specific actions? Theorists differ amongst themselves on this point. Some hold that a particular emotion, say fear, will prepare us for the sorts of actions, fight or flight, that are called for when we are in danger. But there are others, for example, Jesse Prince, who argues that emotions prime us for behavior in a more generalized way rather than for specific behaviors. This could mean that they prime us to do something, whatever it is, or that they prime us for an open-ended range of actions, and we take those choices, we prefer those choices which are environmentally adaptive, or which through our past experience we have come to recognize as beneficial for our own self. But, these emotions have not been recognized as an aid to decision making. But as I have pointed out right at the beginning, that it goes against our making rational choice, and so we should keep our cool, and we should always calculate in a very even-headed manner, and then take any decision. But this way of viewing things have been questioned by the experimental economists and neuroeconomists, and it has been revealed in and through their experiments that we do not always try to, say, maximize our utility. Many of the time, we opt for the best overall choice instead of going in for our choice based on self-interest. So, of the many games that have been used by these experimental economists and neuroeconomists, I would mention two famous games. One is the Ultimatum game, and the other is the Prisoner's Dilemma. And as you know, that Prisoner's Dilemma is a very well-known dilemma, and when I searched for this Prisoner's Dilemma in Google Scholar in 2018, it turned out almost 49,560 entries, and in the last 5 years it must have doubled or tripled, I don't know, because neuroeconomists are still experimenting with these two games, and game theorists are very interested in it. I'm not entering into the logical or technicalities of game theory. I'll just state the games in very simple terms. So, suppose that there are two players, they were playing, and somebody approaches them and offer them some money, say 100 rupees. And one of them was told that he or she will be the in charge of the booty, and he or she can distribute it as he or she feels fit. So, suppose Josh is given the charge of the booty, and Josh decides that how much money he is going to keep for himself and how much he is going to pass on to his friend. And say his friend Dominic, he actually would have to either accept or reject the proposal. If he accepts the proposal of Josh, then the booty will be divided according to their agreed principle. And if Dominic rejects Josh's offer, then they will not get anything. So what will be the rational course of action? If you want to maximize your utility only, then Dominic should have accepted any offer that Josh had made, because he would get something, and something is better than nothing. But we find that when this game was played, at least, in most of the cases, we find that proposers often offer between 40% to 50% of the endowed amount, and this split has almost always been accepted by the responders. But when the proposal falls to 20% of the endowment, it is rejected about half the time, and the rejection rates increases as the proposal falls to 10% and lower. So this is, is a bit odd, because if somebody refuses to take 10%, that is, say, 10 rupees out of 100 rupees or $10 out of $100, then he is not going to receive anything. So why the proposer is offering, say, 50% or 40%, knowing very well that he could have offered less, and why the person who is responding, he is also denying to have, the lower sum of money, and not preferring it over not getting anything. That is a puzzle. And when this was, repeated, it was a one-shot game, then we could not decide that what actually motivated them to behave in this way. But when it was repeated, it was found that, the turn was changed, that Dominic's become the proposer once and Josh becomes the proposer in the next round. And then we find that Dominic offers more money if Josh has been, more generous in his own turn. And so, in one way, we find that their cooperative behavior, that is also rooted in their self-interest, and that interest is motivated by various different things. Maybe in the first instance, Josh wanted to impress Dominic, and that is why offered, say, 50% of the share. Or maybe he had, soft corner for Dominic. That is why he wanted to offer him 50%. Or he might have thought that being, more miserly will lead to, rejection, or he will be, in his turn, will receive less. And so he was apprehensive, and that is why he offered, say, 40% to 50%. But in all these cases, we find that these reasons, they are not purely rational reasons, but these are more, motivated by different kinds of emotions. And similar things happen in the prisoner's dilemma. And prisoner's dilemma's story is, very simple. suppose two suspected criminals, A and B, are arrested on a serious charge and are placed in separate cells with no way of communicating with each other. A clever police officer informs A that till now there is not enough evidence to convict the pair. If both A and B remain silent, then they will be charged with a minor offense and will be sentenced to 1 year each in prison. If, say, A confesses and B remains silent, A will be released for turning state's witness, and B will serve full 4 years in jail. And if both A and B confess, each of them will receive 2 years behind the bars. And B is also told the same information in his cell, and the officer tells A to decide what A would do before A and B are interviewed separately in the evening. Now the question is, what would be rational for A to do? It seems that A should confess, since whatever B does, A will minimize her sentence by confessing. If B stays silent, A will get off scot-free. If B confesses, A will serve half the term, that is 2 years. And this is a somewhat disappointing outcome, but better than serving 4 years. However, since B is rational too, he will also presumably try to lessen his convicted period in the jail, and so he might also decide to confess. And so in the long run, we find that both of them are serving 2 years in jail. And so by acting in this apparently rational way, each ends up worse off than if they both have kept silent. So if A had been confident that B would also remain silent and B would not rat on him, then keeping silent would have been the best strategy, the most rational. But A was not sure about B's response, and therefore he took the second best option. And here we find that somebody is taking the second best option because he or she is afraid that his partner in crime may rat on him. And so here we find that he is really taking the second best alternative. And so there is something unsettling about this puzzle, because here prisoner's dilemma goes against the common notion of rationality, since both prisoners produce a worse outcome than that which two irrational prisoners would have reached under the same circumstances. So somebody tried to say that what they are doing, they are following a rationally irrational way out. And how they are being rationally irrational? By following their gut feeling. It's not by calculation, or it is not by, say, received information that they are coming to this conclusion, but in most cases they are really following their gut feeling. And this happens in many contexts, and so we have to admit that emotion doesn't always lead us astray without the guidance of reason, but rather it paves the way for not only, say, advantageous results, but also help us avoiding catastrophic consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Chatterjee, for finishing on time. She has really given a very new approach to the emotion-reason conflict, and she has rightly pointed out that it's the emotions which can really aid and assess, or aid and really help rationality itself. So now it is open for discussion. We can have three questions at least. Please give the mic to our scholar here.
Thank you, Professor Amita Chatterjee, for your excellent presentation. See, in our life we take decision, right? So, what is the best way, best method to take right decision, according to you?
According to me, actually, I'm claiming that yes, emotions do lead us astray. We cannot really say that emotions give us, 100% right direction. But when we do not have, say, sufficient data to arrive at a reasoned conclusion, we have to depend on emotions, and emotions really guide us in taking in making the right choice. So it depends on the situation, it depends on one's, say, personality, and also on one's personal history, because if really we had been duped by emotion all the time, we would tend to avoid emotion, that path. But sometimes, we are really beneficial by following emotions.
But you said one very interesting statement during your statement, that database decision, probably that's the best.
If we have data, if we have sufficient data.
I think we have to pass on to the new question. Yeah, please, thank you. So, mic here, please, on the other side. Two hands have been raised. I think both will be allowed to raise the question.
Good morning, madam. Throughout centuries, human-led or anthropocentric activities have led to natural and environmental disasters. In that case, would you like to say that it is totally upon the perception of human cognitive sense that we are led to work on them to correct the environmental issues, or it is even emotional driven based? Because Hutto is over there, Professor Hutto, he knows that what is the massive extent of the wildfires there in Australia. So upon these cases, how would you like to assess the emotional quotient and the cognitive sense of the human perception to work on these issues?
Definitely, I agree with you. And if you look at the, carbon emission scenario, it is the best. It is the rationally, it is the best strategy, to continue to use, energy, high carbon energy, and make others follow the rule of avoiding carbon emission. But if everybody behaves in this way, then it will lead to disaster. And there we will have to have compassion for others, consideration for others, and forego the best rational strategy.
Yes, please.
Professor Chatterjee, good morning. Your presentation was quite informative. I just would like to know a very small, simple thing. Like emotion is more a right brain activity, okay, and rationality and reasoning is more left brain oriented. So, like when we have to take any decision, we should sustain in the long run. So, what do you think? We need to maintain a balance between this left and right brain activity, and then we have to take the decision, or we will be more inclined on the right brain part?
Actually, we don't consciously, choose which hemisphere is going to be active.
I mean,
so when a catastrophic situation is there, our right brain takes up and the way our brains are primed, that way we tend to react and respond. And so it doesn't depend on our decision that whether the right brain will be activated or the left brain will be activated. But of course, yes, you can say that since it's our action.
No supplementary question, please.
Action depend on priming and priming of the neural pathways. Therefore, if we tend to prime the left brain more, then the left brain will react more quickly. But that doesn't happen always.
The last question, please.
Thank you, madam, for the excellent presentation. First thing to say that I'm not a student of philosophy. Rather, I'm a student of medical science. I attended this seminar because it is a very interesting topic to me. You have told about Phineas gauge. First thing to state that it is basically not a case of Damasio. It was a case from where actually some experiments of cognitive neurology started. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis, this is basically a hypothesis. This is not a scientific truth.
Please be brief. We have running short of time, please.
Okay, I can say that emotion, madam said about Phineas gauge case, here the damage in cortex, the part of the cortex was orbitofrontal cortex, it actually controls the lower cortex, lower area of brain, that is limbic system. So here, emotion is not taking upper hand. Here, the rational cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, it is taking control over emotion. So, Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis is just rejected now in cognitive neuroscience. Okay. This much I can say. Thank you.
Thank you for your information. I didn't say that it was discovery of Damasio. I just said that those who have read Descartes' era, they have come to know about Phineas gauge from Damasio, and Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis says this. And
no, please.
So, yes, theories, new theories are coming up, and older theories are being discarded, but that is, only for the time being. And we don't know whether once again there will be a revival of that or not with the help of some novel findings.
Thank you very much. And before I invite Professor Guha to speak, let me introduce her. Professor Maushumi Guha, Professor of Department of Philosophy, Jadavpur University. She is also a regular member of the teaching and research faculty at the School of Cognitive Science at Jadavpur University. She has done her MPhil in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, England, and PhD from Jadavpur University. Theory of mind domain is her primary research area, and her areas of teaching and research interests are cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology, with a special reference to development cognitive psychology, imitation, mind reading, theory of mind in typical and atypical cases, with a special interest in the theory of mind of blind persons. Also, she is interested in studies in false belief understanding and philosophy of mind in general. So now I invite Professor Guha to speak. Her topic is Spinoza, a special problem of other minds.
Can you hear me, please? Thank you, sir. I think I'm not an egotist, but I think I should remove this because I dare not take upon the identity of Professor Hutto. Good morning, everyone. My pranam to the holy and the divine, as this is not just an intellectual venue, but also a sacred one. I begin with an invocation to my Gurudev, Sri Sri Paramahansa Yoganand, and to the Param Gurus, to Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and to Swami Vivekananda. Brahmanandang Paramasukhadang Kevalang Jnanamurting Dvandvatitang Gagana Sadrishang Tattvamasya Dilaksham Ekang Nityam Vimalamachalam Sarvadi Sakshibhutang Bhavatitang Trigunarahitang Sadgurung Tang Namami. I take this opportunity to acknowledge my grateful thanks to the organizers for having me here with those whose books we read and teach in our classrooms, with my teachers and seniors around me. I'm extremely nervous because I also see Sir Professor Prabal Sen here right in front of me, but I'll try to do my best. I have divided my paper into small issues, though I have not divided it into proper sections. I have a small introduction where I talk about the problem of other minds in its many avatars, and then I move on to discuss how we may address these various things from within Spinoza's metaphysics. I quickly end by saying that the problem of other minds perhaps stands solved or dissolved in Spinoza, and we are finally liberated from a centuries-old Cartesian trap. Let me admit at the outset that I am not in any way a scholar in this field. The history of Western philosophy is what I discover as and when the occasion arises. I had read Descartes while studying philosophy of mind, and then I did a little bit of studying on Leibniz's philosophy of mind for a particular seminar. And the only other pillar of rationalism, Benedict Spinoza, I thought of reading a little bit more so that I can consciously apply my learned conceptions of the problem of other minds to this very interesting and different kind of philosopher. Little did I realize that reading Spinoza was like reading history, politics, and religion, besides Aristotle, Descartes, Leibniz, Hobbes, Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, Islamic, Judaic, and Christian thought. But I could not retract from my word given to the organizers of this seminar, so here I am, presenting a hodgepodge of ideas, some learnt and some imagined. I shall start with a topic that is closer to my heart and to my intellect, the problem of other minds in the philosophy of mind. It is understood in many different ways. First, it is a metaphysical problem, given Cartesian philosophy and mind-body substance dualism. The strange possibility that one might be a lone mind amongst a sea of zombies is opened up by Descartes' privileged access theory. So as I always tell my students, Descartes was a dualist in not one but many ways. He was a mind-body dualist, a self-other dualist, a human-animal dualist, a perception-inference dualist, an introspection-inference dualist, an introspection-perception dualist, and more. In this avatar, the problem of other minds translates into a skeptical doubt about the very existence of other minds. And this skepticism, like other forms of doubt, stems from an epistemological concern about our access to the inner reality of other minds. If there is no way in which that innerness can be comprehended, if other minds are outer to my existence like bodies, living, dead, or inanimate, then just as one might bring up the argument from illusion to question the existence of the physical world, one might doubt if there are others with minds at all. But unlike the argument from illusion and its application to the physical world, skepticism about other minds seems to be easily put to rest by the scare of solipsism. Serious philosophers who seem to love idealism or the logic behind it equally passionately detest solipsism and envisage all kinds of means to tide over it. Solipsism, it seems, is bad for philosophy, so other minds exist and the ontological problem of other minds seems to be solved. Even the honest idealist, the champion of the subject, is frightened by solipsism and humanity is thus saved. But matters seem to get a little complicated when we think of other minds as not just other human minds, but all kinds of other minds, like minds of octopuses, dolphins, or even seahorses. Such things are interesting not only to the adventurer, the scuba diver. There's this book, Other Minds, the Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness by Peter Godfrey Smith. The conjurer, the tarot reader. I am here referring to an article by Akil Bilgrami, Dummett, Realism and Other Minds, and of course this is an indirect reference to Dummett. or documentary filmmaker, but also to the philosopher. For Descartes, other minds would only be human minds. But for those who are kinder to other creatures of God, evolution, or even AI, that is, if creature were to mean anything created, the problem of other minds takes on a different shade. See, reading the minds of those who never lived. Enhanced beings, the social and ethical challenges posed by super intelligent AI and reasonably intelligent humans. An article by John Harris. Then comes the epistemological problem of other minds, which ramifies into myriad theories, both in classical and contemporary philosophy of mind. The heart of the solutions lie in two basic structures, the perceptual and the inferential. The question addressed is, how do we know other minds? It arises from a Cartesian commitment to privacy, immediacy, infallibility of self-knowledge as opposed to the opacity, immediate nature and fallibility of knowledge of other minds. Classical options were the argument from analogy, inference to the best explanation or SI, inductive generalizations from particular cases, direct access theories of various sorts, various forms of embodiment, which are obviously in defiance of the Cartesian inaccessibility of other minds. In contemporary terms, they would translate primarily into the theory and the simulation theory. Several phenomenological and embodied views, certain neuroscientific explanations in terms of, for example, mirror neurons and other such discoveries. What philosophers were classically doing is giving descriptions in personal terms of what perhaps goes on when people perform acts of knowing other minds or acts of knowing thoughts, feelings and other states of minds. Contemporary philosophers were doing that and more, they are doing that and more, and they are trying to align with some scientific discovery or model or functional characterization of the inner mechanisms of knowing other minds. My interest in Spinoza arose during my undergraduate teaching course, and I realized that I hardly knew anything, but it also arises from my interest in pantheism and its cousin, panpsychism. I looked up pantheism in some standard dictionaries and then conducted a JSTOR search. I found that it has two meanings associated with it. The first is the one we will need. So pantheism is the philosophical belief that everything is God and God is everything. Under this interpretation, God is the same as the universe. The other meaning of pantheism is usually associated with those religions in which there is belief in or worship of multiple gods. In practice, Hinduism or ancient Greek religion could be considered pantheistic. Like most concepts in philosophy, pantheism takes on many shades. Thankfully, under any interpretation of that word, the actual philosophical views that would be covered seem to converge. The first meaning is therefore applicable to Spinoza's pantheism. This view also implies that God is the totality of all existing things and that this totality is real. This gives a sense of unity which is far above metaphysical holism. This God is not just the collection of all things in the universe, a mere renaming of it, but one whole entire being of which the particulars are either parts or manifestations or modes in Spinoza's language. What is meant by the claim that the totality of things is unified? I'm quoting here. It means, I suggest, that the totality is at least as much of a genuine individual as the most individual part of it. In fact, it is more likely than not that anyone who believes that the universe is a unified totality will believe that it is more of a genuine individual than anything within it. I quote from Sprigg, 1997, The Monist. Copleston, in an article titled Pantheism in Spinoza and the German Idealists, says, in a paraphrasing of Schopenhauer, that his chief objection against pantheism is that it says nothing. that it simply enriches language with a superfluous synonym of the word world. For if a philosopher starts off with the physical world and proceeds to call it God, he has not added anything to the world except a label. A label which, if we take into account the ordinary significance of the word God, might well appear unnecessary and superfluous. Neither the Jew, nor the Christian, nor the Muslim understand by God the physical world, so that if someone calls the physical world God, he cannot be taken to mean that the world is God according to the Jewish or Christian or Muslim understanding of God. And that is how Spinoza came to be known as an atheist in his own circles. Would he have been interpreted differently if he had been amongst the Hindus? This is a question I leave to philosophers of religion and any earnest researcher on Spinoza. Some great work in comparative philosophy or religion can be done to add to some popular writings in the media and a few scattered academic ones on this theme. For example, see India and the Comparative Method by Willem Hafbas in Philosophy East and West, and the book Spinoza in the Light of Vedanta by R.K. Tripathi from BHU. Pantheism is related to other concepts like panentheism and perhaps distantly to panpsychism. These are issues for some future exploration, but to me this group of concepts is significant from a philosophy of mind point of view, and it is also an important question whether by promulgating pantheism, Spinoza is also tacitly promoting panpsychism. This is significant from an other mind's point of view. Ontologically speaking, if pantheism implies panpsychism, at least the existence of other minds cannot be put to question. There can be no skepticism about other minds, and philosophers need not hold solipsism in fear. But if pantheism does not imply panpsychism, which is likely to be the case in Spinoza, who admits infinite attributes and modes, and definitely admits at least the attributes of physicality and mentality, then the ontological problem of other minds perhaps assumes a new form. One argument I found in Copleston that could be used to demonstrate some implications for the problem of other minds is this: if God is infinite, complete, perfect, universal and whole, it is not clear why he, she or it would appear in many forms, modes or attributes, and why such appearance would be contrary to the core monism of his philosophy. And if monism had to be, how would Spinoza accept the differentiation required for acknowledging the existence and knowledge of other minds? I remember when I was doing my master's from Jadavpur University, we had a viva, and a viva was an examination at the end of it, and I was asked by my teacher how I would differentiate between the knower and the known in Advaita Vedanta. At that point of time, I did not have any good answer. And now, while reading Spinoza, it just came to my mind that the same question could be raised here, and at this point of time, this question would be important from the point of view of the problem of other minds. Spinoza, it seems to me, is axiomatically a monist, even though he argues to prove and establish his monism as a theorem. His arguments actually refer back to his belief in a single substance. Monism is assumed when he claims that two or more substances cannot have the same nature. For it is not immediately clear why that is so unless one is already a monist. A monist is one who believes in a single substance, and if a single substance is that which can subsist on its own independently, then it must have features that are exclusive to it. And this is also essentially the same core argument in favor of an infinite substance. A substance that is so independent may be seen to be infinite, containing within itself all possible features that may be manifested in the world around us. Monism might seem like a rather solipsistic proposition, but in Spinoza that cannot be the case. For neither the mental nor the physical can take precedence in the logical scheme of his philosophy. So a single substance view in Spinoza is not a single mind view. Indeed, the many attributes of this substance make it quite likely that minds are just one kind of other kinds of other, and the knowledge that minds might have of them is an issue that needs to be considered as well. So let us not conflate these 2 or 3 things: knowledge of other human minds, knowledge of other minds, and knowledge of others that are not minds, but in a sense more personal or acknowledgeable, for the want of a word, or reciprocative than inanimate physical things. They could be anything in Spinoza's kind of God-nature pantheism. In an article titled Spinoza's Problem of Other Minds in Synthese, Joel Friedman, has discussed the second and third issues. To quote, Spinoza's problem may be stated as follows: are there other minds, are there other kinds of minds which, though isomorphic to my own, perceive things under the unknown attributes, and are such minds compatible with the isomorphism between the attributes? In other words, are these other minds compatible with the perfect parallelism? The question is closely allied with the question whether the attribute of thought has a special place in Spinoza's system. Given the perfect parallelism of the attributes and the Spinozistic proposition that each attribute expresses the essence of God, it seems that thought should have no special place among the attributes. Yet, in dealing with the problem of other minds, it would appear that Spinoza does give thought a special place. Spinoza's monism is peculiar in that, despite its standpoint of substantive unity, it admits of an infinite plurality of attributes. Minds or intellects fall under the attribute of thought, and they are not subject to the monistic worldview. One should not mistake this for a subjectivist view dwelling on the argument from illusion, whereby monism is reduced to solipsism. No, Spinoza is not an idealist. Attributes and modes are real. The parallelism between the attributes is real. God is a complex unity. It is neither simple nor divisible. And the modes are various. Let me take a look now at the possibility of an argument by analogy. What are the questions we can ask Spinoza? Is there a thinker who thinks through the inner connections between thoughts and actions in Spinoza's metaphysics? God is inappropriate for that role. And if we have to think third personally, like a folk psychologist in today's jargon, what is the possibility of folk psychology in such a system? In Descartes, it is possible to impose some semblance of a working folk psychology by imagining that the subject thinks through the connections between thoughts and behavior. Though the observational levels of these two are distinct in the Cartesian system, one belonging to the inner mental realm and the other to the outer bodily realm, the paracausal or pseudo-causal Cartesian system may yet permit some folk psychology to be operative. But I wonder how such a thing could be possible in Spinoza's substance monism on the one hand and critical modal pluralism on the other. A more likely approach to mind reading, again using today's jargon, in Spinoza could be a simulationist one. A strict parallelism combined with pantheism prepares good ground for a simulationist account to the problem of other minds. But a word of caution here, mental simulation is not a homogeneous notion. It has innumerable versions with subtle variations that can only be discerned by one who has sufficient exposure to this domain, which among the many versions of mental simulation may apply, if at all, to a Spinozistic system may be something worth investigating for the philosopher of mind or a researcher in this domain. Why I think such an exploration is important is that the entire history of modern Western philosophy, Descartes downwards, has been subject to such analysis in two great volumes by Anita Abramides and Alec Hislop, but Spinoza remains largely unanalyzed. I think it is the monism in his philosophy that deters us from such analysis. But there are two things that we must remember. Such monism is not functional at an empirical level. Maybe I'm bringing in a little bit of my exposure to Advaita Vedanta here, but I wouldn't make any such commitment. Yeah, I'm done. Even within a unity, there could be internal differentiations. The other, again, is a word of caution. There may be a risk in interpreting Spinoza even at the empirical level as a simulationist if mental simulation involves true engagement. True engagement. It is here that I must end and must say, as a matter of formal ending, that despite all the pressure from the empirical sciences and the standards and methodologies thereof, philosophy is an intellectual and exploratory exercise. And I just wanted to give one last glimpse from my thoughts on how exploratory we can get. And so I thought that we could say that we set our limits or set limits to our thoughts either by experiential boundaries or limitations of reasoning or powers of our imagination beyond which we go crazy. When we sing khayal in Hindustani classical music, we compose tans and alaps. These are bound by the overall structure of the rag or ragini we are performing. The novice always fears or nurtures this rather useful nervousness that she might be going out of tune. And going out of tune in Hindustani classical music is not merely losing bass with the octave or the scale. It is far more dangerous than that. And it can lend one to come out as an outcast in the community of singers. So I end by saying that I fear that I might have gone a little too far with my explorations of Spinoza, but I hope that some researcher would take up such a thing.
Thank you, Maushumi, for your excellent presentation. She has brought really Spinoza into limelight in the present scenario of philosophy of mind, and I think only 2 questions we can accept this time and not more. Mike, please.
Makes me nervous.
I have 3. Is this a proof by Arthapatti? Are all minds nodes of God? Node as in node with M, not a mode. Can 2 minds share an attribute?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Should I answer? Okay, the second question and the first question, I cannot answer. I cannot answer the first one because I don't know much about it and I have to explore this. So I thank you for the question. The second question I cannot answer because I don't have any understanding of a notion of node in Spinoza's philosophy. So I'll have to talk to you again after this. The third one, the answer is yes. Yes. Definitely 2 modes could work under the same attribute.
Any other question here? That should be the last one.
Thank you so much, Professor Guha. Now, Spinoza also invites us to cultivate what he calls as intellectual love for God. Now, that brings us to the issue, also a related issue, of mind, patience, and nature. Spinoza does talk about patience in his ethics. So in this context, how do we interact with these elements, especially thinking about mind and nature, an ecological notion of mind, like Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And my final submission is that your reference to Spinoza and cross-cultural philosophy, there are studies which show that Spinoza was really influenced by both Gita and Buddhism. I wish to mention that Professor Chittaranjan Das, who studied in Santiniketan, who was one of the early scholars to write on Spinoza, and his book on Spinoza has been published.
Thank you so much. Thank you. With regard to the first part, which is a question, I will have to talk or think about it because I haven't really touched upon the ethics aspect of the Spinozistic philosophy. The second one is most welcome. Thank you. I will.
Thank you. I thank all the speakers of this session, and we had an excellent session. I think we started with Enactivism, went through emotional reason conflict, and ended with the great Spinoza. So it's a great day for us because Spinoza I like very much. So Spinoza is, in spite of his monism, he is the model of a philosopher. Okay, thank you everybody. For the audience also I thank for their excellent questions. Thank you everybody.